All right, such a wonderful day to have our children up and singing and lighting the second Advent candle. Our theme for Advent is this year, Living Christmas. We introduced this last week that, in the season that's filled with nostalgia, with sentimental longing, we want to experience Christmas in the present tense as well. And we look to those lines in a little town of Bethlehem. O holy child of Bethlehem, descend to us, we pray. Cast out our sin and enter in, be born in us today. And that's that focus that we're praying that Christ might be born anew in us today. And so we're bringing the same two questions into every message this month as we're leading up to Christmas. First, how will Christ be born in you this Christmas? How will Christ be born in you this Christmas? And how will we be able to share the message that Christ is born anew in those who need to hear that good news? And so it works both within our own hearts, but also within our witness in the community, because we have good news. And as we've read through this Bible year, it's obvious that this is the mission that we have as Christians and as the church, to share this good news. If not in our words, at least in the way that we enter into the world and we live together. Now, we asked those two questions last week in light of the scriptures that we're reading in our Bible year. We're in Paul's letters, and last week we looked at Paul's letters to the Galatians and the Ephesians, and how those letters dealt with this conflict between Jewish and Gentile Christians as Paul called for unity in Christ. And I ended that message by saying that if we allow Jesus to reconcile even one of our broken relationships, just like that broken relationship between the Jews and Gentiles, if we can allow Jesus to reconcile even one, then think how much more full the world would be of love for each one of us to have one reconciliation. And the power of Christ's love would be there for all to see, because Christians who are reconciled, Christians who are united in love and in service, it's a powerful testimony that our life together is a witness to that living Christmas. Well, today we're taking that same idea of how we allow it to be in our hearts and in our witness by looking at hope. Christians who hold on to hope in all circumstances. To experience a living Christmas, we need to have hope that's kindled in our own hearts, and understand hope, what it looks like and feels like to truly live with hope. And then we live with that hope daily. We then become a witness to those who are struggling to find that hope or to know it for themselves. When they see it in us, then maybe they can imagine it for their own lives. Now, I don't have to tell you that hope is in short supply these days. As we look around in our larger cultures, we read all the surveys about things that people are struggling with, increase in feelings of isolation and of loneliness. There are people who are struggling and are frustrated, who are angry. There's very real physical and emotional and psychological and spiritual suffering that people are going through, so many things, a lot of it hidden, and they simply don't know which way to turn. Hope is such an important thing for us to get right. And so we turn back to Paul, and we're now in his first letter to the Thessalonians. And in the closing of that letter, this is in Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 16, Paul says to these in Thessalonica, and the church there, rejoice always, pray continually, and give thanks in every situation. Rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in every situation. And when you hear these words and just kind of look at them, you think, well, that could be on a mug at a Christian bookstore, or maybe on a refrigerator magnet or one of those memes that gets sent around. It's a lovely sentiment, maybe even a needlepoint that's up on the wall in our grandmother's house, unless your grandmother doesn't needlepoint. I know mine did. It's a good mantra. It's a wonderful sentiment. Rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in every situation. It sounds like the kind of thing we Christians should do, but it also, when you stop to think about it in our daily living, sometimes feels a little bit detached from how we really feel. Does Paul really know what he's asking when he says, rejoice always and pray continually and give thanks in every situation? Rejoice always? I mean, he didn't have to live through the pandemic like we did. He didn't have to go to those funerals. He didn't have to watch kids out of classrooms struggling to catch up. Or pray continually. He didn't have to live through one of the most polarized and divisive climates in our nation's history, where there's anger and outrage that's just broadcast daily. It's on the news, it's on talk radio, it's on social media, it's on blogs. Give thanks in every situation. He didn't have to endure the stress that we've been through over these past few years that strained our friendships, and it strained our marriages, it strained our churches and our schools. It's not easy to hold on to hope. We like the sentiment. But when we're honest about our realities, it's so easy to just be kind of dismissive of this. It just sort of yeah, that's a good idea, and leave it there. It's easy to be skeptical. It's hard to hold on to hope when cynicism is just so much easier, isn't it? It's just easy just to let and go into being cynical. To say, it, you know what, the world is what it is. That's just how the world works. We're disappointed in things, but we're not surprised by it. We cast ourselves sometimes even as victims and lash out when we feel that way, and our hearts or minds are clogged with contempt for those that we hold responsible for what's going on. And I know I might be overstating it a little bit, and I know that doesn't describe how everybody feels. It's not shared by all, but we do hear that rhetoric. We hear it in the public comments at school board meetings. We hear it from anonymous letters received by neighborhood associations and countless posts shared and reshared on social media. Even if we don't feel that way, we're exposed to it. And it has a way of affecting us, even if it didn't come from within us. It's just around us. And so then we come to worship. And when we come to worship this season, we're reminded, yeah, it is actually Advent. And the core Advent message actually isn't just about Jesus was born. We have a wonderful manger scene here, if you hadn't noticed, on our worship space this year. But it's also the message that Christ is going to come again. That's what Advent keeps pointing us to. And because that's the message, then we have to know that Advent is about hope. And it's not about hope that is just kind of pie in the sky. This is an authentic hope that's not superficial optimism. It's not one that sees the world through rose-tinted glasses, that pretends things aren't the way they are. It's an authentic hope that takes the realities of the world very seriously, and yet nonetheless chooses to rejoice always, and chooses to pray continually, and chooses to give thanks in every situation. Because here's the thing, even though this sometimes feels a little bit detached from reality, Paul's offering these words of hope, these words of encouragement from circumstances that are equal to, at least equal to, anything that we have experienced and faced ourselves. Which is to say, Paul says these words because he's hopeful, but that hope was very hard won. So far in Paul's letters, we've really just focused on the internal challenges that early church faced. You know, we saw it in Acts and in Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, this conflict and culture war between Jewish Christians and Gentile Christians. And that's not a bad place to focus because those messages are still important today. We're still divided today. We still villainize one another as Christians across the globe instead of living in the unity of love and the mutual service that, frankly, Jesus commanded us to be. But these early Christians, not just these internal challenges we see in these letters, but we also see in these letters and in Acts an external challenge that was just as daunting. That these early Christians faced life-threatening persecution. They faced imprisonment by local Roman authorities. They faced ostracization from rival religious and cultural leaders. They ran into the problems with the Roman government, and not just in Rome, but in all of these provincial governments that Rome oversaw, because they would say Jesus is Lord, and they would say Jesus is Lord publicly and loudly and proudly. The problem is it was only legal to say in the Roman Empire that Caesar is Lord. It was treason to say Jesus is Lord. And these early Christians lived in these radically egalitarian households. We looked at that in Acts, how they shared things in common, and we looked at that in Galatians and Ephesians, where there's neither slave nor free, Jew nor Greek, male nor female. They didn't respect these traditions and customs of class and rank or age and ethnicity or gender. And so that caused problems in every of these communities. So we shouldn't be surprised as we're reading Paul's letters, and he says he's writing from prison, because Paul ended up in prison a lot. And in prison in those days, you weren't serving a prison sentence. It was a holding cell where they were going to decide whether they were going to execute you or release you. Those were your two options. And often Paul didn't know which one would be which as he wrote those letters. Just read the beginning of Philippians and you'll see that. Nor should we be surprised with letters like 1 Thessalonians that was written in a time of turmoil and of suffering. You can learn about the context of Thessalonians from Acts chapter 17. There we read that Paul spent 3 weeks in Thessalonica, and he won many converts to Christ. And there you can see a wonderful map. At the very top, you can see Thessalonica. It's near Philippi, there in Macedonia. But the problem is that his activities caused a riot in that city. And that, of course, got the attention of the authorities. It would have probably behooved them to keep their head down a little bit, if only in the interest of self-preservation. But the persecution got really, really intense. And Paul and Silas were the missionaries and the leaders there, and they had to flee the city because of that persecution. But Paul was still concerned about those he left behind, and so about 8 months later, he wrote them this comforting and helpful letter to see how they were holding up and to offer them encouragement, because although they had to escape just to save their lives, the Christians who stayed in Thessalonica were still being persecuted. They were still under pressure. And so given Paul's personal experience of being persecuted, in the course of his ministry, not just in this city, but across the Roman Empire, he was beaten. Paul was stoned. Paul was imprisoned by his enemies. And he often didn't get along well with even some of his friends. His ministry in places was undermined and challenged and rejected by his former friends. And we quickly realized that Paul's words, when he says these things, are grounded in a lived reality of hardship and of suffering. So when Paul says, rejoice always, pray continually, give thanks in every situation, his words aren't trifling. His words aren't empty. They're not separated from the reality of hardship and of struggle. They're not spoken by someone who hasn't experienced the real world or doesn't have a clue about real suffering. His words arise because he has discovered within himself an authentic and living hope. And so how does Paul get to that place spiritually? How is it that we can get to that space and that place spiritually so we can respond as Paul was responding to it? We know it's possible because we probably have folks in our own life, people that we know and that we respect and that we look to, who seemingly have an endless supply of hope regardless of the situation they find themselves in. You see someone who's been, frankly, to hell and back, and yet they haven't given up on life. We see someone who's battled addiction, maybe has even relapsed, but still finds reason to keep trying and to keep fighting. We see someone who's endured far more personal tragedy and loss than you and I, frankly, could ever imagine, and yet they wake up thankful for each new day. Someone who can find joy, someone who seems at peace, even though everything else seems to be unraveling in their world. How do they do it? How do they find that strength? What's their secret? What's Paul's secret? And I say that because, and maybe you're in the same boat with me, I sometimes find myself on the other side of that equation where when things start to kind of go wrong, when things start to get difficult, I lose my way as a Christian. I've seen and you've seen and known, and maybe it even describes us, we become hyper-judgmental when we feel like we're losing control. There's other Christians who lash out with anger and vitriol at the slightest provocation. Forget the fruits of the Spirit. We're angry. We know Christians who gossip and tear others down when they're feeling insecure, who come across as mean-spirited and petty. People who talk about why they don't want to be a part of a church often name some of these qualities in Christians that they see out in the world. We know that sometimes we act this way, who act as victims when they don't get their way. Clearly, hope's not easy. Living in the way Paul is calling us to live isn't easy. Now, as a pastor, I've learned for myself to have compassion and for others to have compassion when I see this kind of behavior because, frankly, there's almost always things going on in people's lives that we'll never know about that's causing them to act out in these ways. So instead of assuming the worst or thinking they're just a bad Christian or a bad person, really we should have compassion and have some curiosity because there's some grief or some loss or some pain that they're struggling with. And that's why these un-Christ-like actions occur. But that said, given the same pain and the same difficulties that we all face from time to time, how can we hold on to hope so that this is what describes our life? So this is the way that we're living in the world. This is what people see, but this is also how we genuinely feel, despite our struggles. Or to put it another way, how can we give thanks in all situations instead of allowing our struggles to cripple us and cause harm to others when we act out? Or how can we experience Christ born anew? I think when Christ is born anew in our hearts, that's what gives us the strength, and that's what gives us the ability to be freed from this bondage to our suffering. And it opens within us the capacity to rejoice and to pray and to give thanks. How do we get there? We can't get there by faking it. It's just not possible. We can't get there through avoidance or denial of life's difficulties when they come. We can't ignore grief that we're going through. We can't fight the tears from flowing. Indeed, many of the ways that we do act out is precisely because we are avoiding avoid dealing with the very real pain we have. I think God instead calls us to confront those realities. I was reminded this week that 70% of the Psalms are Psalms of lament. They're prayers and they're songs of people crying out to God. The Bible's teaching us to lean into the things that grieve our hearts, because when we do lean into it and name it and just know that, sometimes life's hard, once we've done that, we can begin to see what's on the other side of it. And on the other side of it are Psalms like Psalm 23. Yea, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, this valley of tears and of heartbreak, I will not fear. And why is that? Because God is with us. And so I think the first key for people who hold on to hope, it's that they are reminded time and again that they're not alone, that we're never alone, that God is with us. To me, that's the foundation of hope, that no matter what I wake up to in the morning, God is there. And the second follows closely after it, that when we're going through and meet up with these struggles and these griefs and the things that we face in life, that we want to turn towards other people instead of away from them when things get tough. The hardest experiences in life feel isolating. Grief feels isolating. When we mess up and we're facing those consequences, it feels isolating. When things get tough, though, we need to turn towards others. I mean, we do have a tendency to withdraw. It's a way of protecting ourselves. We don't want the attention. We don't want the scrutiny. We don't want the pity. And yet in doing so, we cut ourselves off from the very strength and support that can help us hold on to hope. That's the other secret that Paul knew. And that those that we see who seem to have that endless supply of hope know that they're not doing it alone. They're doing it because they know God is with them, but they're doing it because they have a community that's with them each step of the way. And given that God is known and experienced most powerfully in a community of faith, withdrawing from others actually cuts us off even further from God. And finally, I think the last piece of remembering what it means to have hope is remembering that the worst thing is never the last thing. That's a line from Frederick Buechner, Christian writer of the last century, who was speaking about the resurrection. The Paul says, give thanks in all situations, in every situation, because he knew that the present situation is never going to be the final situation. Our present circumstances aren't our final circumstances, that all things will pass. As the psalmist says, tears may last for the night, but joy comes in the morning, and that's why we have hope. Paul can dare to tell these Thessalonians who faced constant persecution, who faced a danger of being imprisoned, that they should rejoice always and pray continually and give thanks to God in every situation, because they know that God's light is stronger than any darkness that's before them. That the light of Christ shines in the darkness, and the darkness never overcomes it, and that is the good news that we have to share with the world. That's our hope this Advent. It's a hope that I pray each of us will discover and renew and remember the very source of the life and the light that is within us. It's a hope that can be lived out each and every day as we respond to what's going on in our world and in our life. It's a hope that allows Christ's light to shine in us, whatever darkness we face. A hope that allows us to respond to others with kindness and with gentleness, even when they don't deserve it, even when it's on our worst day. Imagine how much light would shine in our world if we committed ourselves to rejoice and to pray and to give thanks in every situation. If the world saw us as Ocala First living that way when we're going to work and when we're going shopping and when we're in meetings and everywhere else we find ourselves, we might just give them a reason to hold on to hope as well. This is a gift that we are given this Advent. A gift of hope. Hope for ourselves, but also hope to share with the world. Let's be a light here in Ocala that shines in the darkness that people are facing.